So welcome, Kristi Crawford, our speaker today at the New Jersey Environmental Fundraisers Gathering. Appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. Excited to see you again as you were at the National Grant Professionals Association Conference. So thank you, Kristi.
Yeah, so I'm gonna share my screen here. We'll hope technology does not. Oh, maybe not. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Give me 2 seconds and I will be more than happy to change that functionality.
Perfect.
Go for it.
All right, now I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Let's see. All right, can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Looking great.
Perfect. Well, I know in the interest of time, I think I have about 40 minutes. I might talk a little fast. So if you have a question, please interrupt me. I think this is a small enough group that we can definitely do that. I'll try to watch the chat function on the screen, but it's hard to kind of do double duty between my screens. But so today's objectives are, we're going to talk through growth in your grant office, whether you're a grant office of one or many. And then reporting for leadership buy-in, communication with that leadership group, and then strategic planning partnership. So I think it's important to note that if you do not have success from kind of the top leadership within your organization, it's going to be hard for your grant office to be successful in your endeavors. And so it's really important to have that success. I am not the expert by any means. I've been doing this for a while. So a little bit about me real quick before we jump into this. So I have been working in the grant field for about 23, 24 years now. I was the first full-time grant staff for my current organization where I am since 2008. So you can see my family a little bit. I have a 22-year-old daughter, a 19-year-old son. So I'm officially an empty nester. My husband works for the sheriff's department in our local community. And when I'm not sitting in this office, I'm usually sitting down here at my lake home, trying to get in as much fishing and sun as possible. So a little bit about me. So I think it's important to kind of highlight the timeline of the growth for my organization before I jump into some of the structure and how we did that growth. I work for an organization called Sanford Health. Sanford Health is the largest rural integrated healthcare system in the United States. We weren't always that big. So I was hired as a first grant writer in the system in 2008. And back then we were called Merit Care Health. It was a regional tertiary hospital in North Dakota. And then we merged a year later between two large healthcare systems, which expanded our footprint for me from one state to about 6 states. And so with that, we gained an additional grant writer that was down at the Sioux Valley Hospital where we merged with. In 2010, we started having discussions between our research grant team and our health services or HSD grant team. So our system back in 2010, the research grant department was totally separate, did not even talk to our non-research department. So for a healthcare system our size, you can imagine we did grants that are research and non-research based. In 2013, we finally formed a centralized office, the grant office, so we had 3 FTEs back then. And then finally in 2014, we merged all of our grant activity into one centralized support service department for our system and gained additional FTE. So at that time we had 6 FTE for the system. So in 2014 was really our big change where we became the one-stop shop for all things grant, pre-award, post-award, compliance, you name it, it all fell in that one department. In 2019, we had another big change where we purchased a long-term care organization called the Evangelical Lutheran Good Samaritan Society. We don't have any facilities in New Jersey, unfortunately, but that did expand our footprint to about 28 states. And we also operate in 8 countries with our international clinics. And so my team really handles all grant activity, like I said, so very large footprint. With that purchase of that organization, we gained an additional 1 FTE. And then as of today, we currently actually have 17 FTE staff that report through my department. So I am the director of our grants team, which is the centralized one-stop shop. And within that team, if you're wondering kind of how we operate, like I said, we do pre-award, post-award, everything all in between. And on my team, I have what's called grant administrators, and those are the non-financial. So those are the people writing grant and then managing the post-award non-financial activities. So reports, working with the funders, no cost extensions, carryovers, et cetera. Then I also have a team of financial grant administrators that report through me. And they are really our finance staff. They are building the budgets. And then when the grant is awarded, they're managing those budgets and all of the financials. I do have a contract administrator on my team as well. So we do have federal acquisition regulation contracts that flow through our team. So those are maybe like our contracts that we bid on to do services with like the Veterans Administration or Indian Health Services or something like that. And then federal compliance, the position actually isn't on my team, but we have a dedicated compliance person that reports to our compliance department. Kind of some of these, I just wanted to make a note too, that I work for a very, very large organization. Some of you might work for a smaller organization. And so some of the stuff has to be kind of adapted based off of the organization or the type that you work for. Obviously, I'm in healthcare. And so not all of you might work in healthcare, but I think some of the reporting that we do will be helpful to kind of see how we gained our support from our leaders at our organization. So maybe some questions, if you want to unmute yourself, or I'll see if I can try to watch the chat room. But so as you're thinking about your grant team growth, I'm kind of curious for some of you all on the call, what does your office look like? How many of you are like a office of one? Maybe raise your hand, or you want to speak up, or trying to watch. Just me. So for you, those of you maybe that didn't respond, are you in an office of multiple people? So it's not just one sole person. See some head noddings. And then just out of curiosity, who do you report through? Do you report through finance, or is there like a foundation, a development office? Development. A lot of development. Okay, or the board, great. So for me, I report actually through our Vice President of Treasury, which is kind of strange, but kind of good as well. So our Office of Treasury handles audit and things like that. So it kind of makes sense that my team reports through Treasury. We used to, once upon a time, report through our foundation and the development office. But with a lot of the standardized general accounting principles that are out there now, and just some of the rules and regulations, it doesn't make sense for federal dollars to flow through, obviously, a foundation, because you want the money to flow through where you do the business. So that's why we kind of changed out of our foundation. And then, so for those of you that it's just, or that it's not just you, do you have finance and non-finance on your team where there's more than one of you? Or maybe if you're a grant professional, do you serve as both roles? As so many of us, when I was an office of one, I did everything. Okay. So for those of you that maybe work for a larger organization, or even if it's not larger, I guess, do you have dedicated legal support to help you with your grants? So whether it's reviewing legal agreements or MOUs or anything like that, or are you stuck doing kind of the legal stuff and trying to be a lawyer yourself? It's like Karen does not. Lawyers on the phone. So working for a larger organization definitely has its perks. We have a dedicated lawyer to us that can help us with any of our grant agreements or MOUs or anything that we're working through, or if we run into like inducement issues that you run into with healthcare. So for us, that's really nice. How about besides lawyer, what about compliance? Or are you the compliance person? Okay. So my last question, just so I kind of want to get a flavor for who's on the call. How long has your grant office been in existence? Or if you're the one and only office of one, how long have they had a grant person on staff? Just kind of curious to see if grants are new to your organizations, or maybe you've been doing them forever and a day. Great. Looks like there's quite a bit of experience on the call with grant team. So I always used to say when I was an office of one, are you on an island? If so, where's your rescue boat? So I talked to so many grant professionals all over the United States, and they are an office of one, and there's such high expectations that they need to, crank out grant after grant after grant, but then they get awarded, and then what? Especially if you're a person doing pre and post award. And so really it's important to get the support from your organization so you can hopefully grow your team instead of being an office of one. Otherwise, you do kind of feel like you're operating on an island without much support. So I'm going to jump into some slides on, okay, how do we get to that growth? So again, this is what worked for me and my organization. Something else might work for your organization, but we really started to track productivity on our team. So here at Sanford, we actually don't have a grant management software that we've purchased to track our grant activity for a variety of reasons. But one of the biggest things is a lot of grant management software out there don't track pre-award and don't track some of the things that we like to measure. So I designed and built a SharePoint site that actually tracks all of our grants, pre-award, post-award, all through closeout, and then all of our task activities that we are responsible for grants. So you can see on this slide, down here is just our task list, so to speak. So these are a variety of tasks that are assigned to a variety of people and their status and when they're due. The task itself, or what it looks like, let's see if I can pull up a bigger. Sorry, I'm trying to switch between slides. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. There we go. So we have on our SharePoint site, we have something called a task list. So every activity that we have to do for a grant, we create a task for it. So then for a variety of reasons, but one being the most important, that let's say that I myself manage 100 grants and tomorrow I decide I'm not going to come to work. I won the lottery, I'm staying home. Someone needs to be able to jump into my grants and be able to manage those effectively without missing a due date. At any given time, we have 400 to 600 active grants within our system that we're managing within my team. And so we cannot drop the ball on those, and we need to make sure that everything is happening seamlessly and smoothly. So our task list is a very simple SharePoint list that I designed, where we basically put the name of the task, our internal routing number, which is a consistent number that's assigned to all of our grants, all the way from pre-award to closeout. Who the task is assigned to, a description, and then the type of activity is a drop-down list of about 30 or 20 different activities that you can choose from, and then the due date. The really nice thing about this task list is, like I said, we can measure productivity. I can also sort within SharePoint of all the tasks assigned to certain staff, whether it's myself or someone else, or the type of task itself, whether it's a report to funder, a check-in, a closeout, what have you. What we did on our team to start measuring productivity is trying to figure out how long does it take to complete these activities. So we met as a team and looked at all of our core activities that we conduct on grants and tried to figure out how long does it take to do that. So if it's like a report to funder, whether it's federal or non-federal, we assigned an average time of how long it takes. Now, is this an exact science? No, but it's on average. So for those of you that have been around grants for a while, you know that sometimes you could get like a small privately funded foundation grant, and you could have a federal grant. And that private grant is more of a headache to deal with than that federal grant with the things that you have to do. So sometimes that private grant takes way more than a federal grant time to do. So what we kind of tried to do is, on average, how much time does it take? So from there, this is a list of all of our different types of activities that we have. We really worked through and tried to figure out how much time does it take for a finance person or a non-finance person, federal, non-federal, research, non-research. For those of you that work both in research and maybe non-research, you might be aware that there's a lot of varieties that happen between those two types of grants. And so whether it's, like I said, effort tracking, the closeout, a report to the funder, subaward, whatever, we basically took this list and tried to assign a time kind of how long it would take to do that. So from there, I actually have the ability to download, because it's in SharePoint and you can export very easily into Excel, download all of our tasks that we complete on a monthly basis and try to figure out how many FTEs based off of our time kind of studies or our calculations on average does it take to do these activities, and are we on point with how many FTEs we have, or are we working under over? This was my way of being able to justify to the leaders to be and the people that are in charge of the budgets, those bean counters that make sure we balance to zero, that we really did our due diligence to justify through numbers and statistics of how we needed additional staff. And so I can run a report that looks very similar to this, where it's a breakdown of all the activities, the effort, the calculation. I can take all of these, run them for a month, and then at the end of my report, do my math. And so we came up with, 2,000 hours of activities for an FTE equivalent, which those of you that don't calculate FTE is an full-time FTE is 2,080 hours. How many FTEs at that time were on the payroll versus how much FTEs we needed to do these above tasks. And for this example, you can see that in the month of August, my team worked an extra 3.8 variance of FTE, which makes sense because back in August of 2021, my staff were all very overworked due to COVID and just some things that we had going on, and we were short-staffed due to burnout and things like that. And so for me, this is my ability to say, okay, if we do that in 1 month, what does it look like trending? Are we consistently working more FTEs than what we have? Are we working less? If we have 1 month that's really out of whack, I usually kind of, yes, it's there, but I maybe don't do a whole lot with it. However, after 2, 3, 4 months that we are really have a strong variance discrepancy between our FTEs and what we're actually doing, that's where I start saying to my leader, I think we need to add another staff. We're really overworking the current staff. So this is, like I said, something that we did for all of our activities across our system to do the growth piece. If you don't have your leadership support, it's going to be very hard to ask for another FTE. Budgets are tight, times are hard. Sometimes it can be an upward battle to be able to add an FTE. In my experience, since I've been with Sanford for about 15 years, there's only been a couple of times where my leaders have been like, nope, you are not adding another person. And then we sometimes have to get a little creative of how to add that person. But typically they have been very supportive because I've had these numbers to back it up. And that's what's really gotten us to add those FTEs. Any questions so far? Okay. What I wanted to kind of do, have you think about, and again, we only have, 40 minutes, so I'm going to sort of run through this, but, think about this after the fact, but think of a monthly task that you guys do on your team. So whether it's a report to funder, budget development, writing the grant itself, maybe, but think of a task that you do every month routinely, and then start to think about how long does it take to complete that task. Then for those of you that don't have tracking tools like what I showed you through our task lists, start thinking about how many of those do you do each month. Once you kind of start thinking through those 3 things, then you can start repeating it with other tasks that you do on a routine basis. The important thing to remember if you are starting to calculate, the productivity and how much time it takes you to do those tasks, don't forget about your annual tasks. So for me and my department, we are responsible for the single audit that's produced for our system because we have over $750,000 in federal funding every year. My team is also responsible for the annual budgeting process for all grant cost centers. So we have to input budgets within there. There are also a couple of other things that we're responsible for on an annual basis, our indirect cost calculation, things like that. And so we took a look at all of those annual tasks and start to think about like how long does it start from start to finish does it take to do that. And so like for budgeting, instead of having a couple of hours, it might take 100 and some hours to get our budgeting process done. So start thinking about those annual tasks. Then if you have other tasks that are hard to like figure out, for example, finance during month end close, which right now for us, it's month end close. So for every close, we have 6 business days until we can close our books. For finance, every day they're doing something differently. But for finance, they're 6 business days. And then after that, to prepare all the invoices that go out the door, my finance staff kind of lumped that all together in sort of one type of task and did like a month end close and then attach time to that. So for my team, it takes them about like 40 hours per person to get through their month end close and do all their invoicing for the month. So kind of think about that too, if it's hard to assign maybe a productivity measure or timestamp, so to speak, on an activity. So once you have kind of figured out all of your tasks, how long it takes, then try to think about how you can track that. So if you don't have a tool already, like our SharePoint tool, which by the way, if you have the Microsoft Office platform, the SharePoint is actually free. It's part of that package. If your IT department will let you deploy it or use it, that's another thing. But it is free. So if you're not familiar with SharePoint, it is a great tool. If you're tracking in Excel, fine, great. You might need to maybe beef up some of your columns or make some pivot tables or VLOOKUPs, whatever the case may be. Or maybe you are fortunate and you have a grant management software that already tracks some of these activities. Whatever the case may be, you just have to then take the report from whatever system you're using and then start assigning the productivity measures to all of those tasks to come up with how many FTEs does it take to do your work in a month. I will tell you that it's going to be very surprising when you first start doing this, because I'm guessing that every single one of you on this call probably work more than 40 hours a week, and you probably are working way more than 1 FTE if you look at it over a course of a year. I know I found that very eye-opening for my team when I started seeing that we were all working way more than what we had allocated to us. So any thoughts on kind of how we sort of came up with that productivity measure and assigning those numbers? Can you think of anything that you feel like is missing from some of that productivity measures, or any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to jump into reporting.
Kristi, hi, this is Denise. A real quick question. I'm with the Alliance for Morris County Parks, but I'm thinking about this for our park commission and the work that's like some of the park maintenance staff do, for example. How did you figure out the time it takes to do a task? Did you go to, say there's 3 people involved in that task and ask them and then take an average?
Yeah, so we got our entire team together in a room and we just went one by one through them and started to figure it out. And then that's where we kind of discovered, oh, it takes longer to do a federal grant than it does a private grant, obviously. So starting to figure out that breakdown. And then we actually get together as an entire team every 6 months to review those numbers and just say, do you feel like anything's changed? Because we gain efficiencies throughout the year in our process all the time. So maybe something takes less time, or maybe something takes more time. So we review it every 6 months after we kind of set those numbers as well.
Got it.
But I really think it needs to be a group discussion, because if you're not the one in the thick of things doing the work, it's really hard for you to assign how much time it takes.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, reporting to leadership, my favorite thing. I spend a lot of time every month doing this. So some questions to think about before you start trying to determine what makes the most sense to report to your leadership and what does leadership mean to you, is what does your CEO know about grants? So here at our healthcare system, we have a president and CEO of our overall health system. And then we have like what we call market presidents that are responsible for certain markets. The organization I work for, I am very blessed that our CEO is very supportive of grants. Hasn't always been the case, but our current CEO is very supportive of grants and sees the value that they bring to the organization. I think especially with COVID, I always say that COVID was like the worst and best thing to happen to my team, because as you can imagine, it took us a lot of work and a lot of things to do to manage. We went from well, we increased our dollars that we report on our single audit from about $30 million annually to $330 million. So $300 extra million in 2 years in a row to deal with. So that was, I think, really great because it elevated our reporting to leadership and what they wanted to know about grants and things like that. So yeah, COVID was the worst and best thing to ever happen. Although the 80-hour work weeks were not my favorite. So I'm glad to be on the tail end of that. And then what is your frequency of reporting? Do you have the opportunity to report to your leadership team every month, every quarter, every week, maybe? I have no idea, things like that. And then how do you promote your grant awards internally and externally? So even though you're not reporting maybe some grant awards directly to leadership, if you're promoting those externally, chances are they're going to hear about them and kind of see them throughout social media. So when I say my leadership, it means a variety of things. Usually for reporting to my leadership team when it comes to grants, that is our executive leadership team. So like our C-suite, our president, our CFO, people like that. I also have to report to a group of vice presidents that kind of operate finance, operational leaders, things like that. So I report to a variety of leaders when it comes to some of our grant things. But probably primarily I report to our C-suite the most because they're the ones that want to know the bottom line. If you're, to go back to this, if your CEO is not real knowledgeable about grants, that can be kind of a hard thing of trying to figure out how to educate them on the importance of grants. So if you don't report directly to the CEO or president of your organization, is there a leader within your organization that's very supportive of grants that can help kind of sell your case or kind of promote you as well, or your team? Because it is so crucial that your CEO is knowledgeable about grants. If they don't understand that, there's so much compliance and risk and things like that with it, sometimes CEOs think, oh, it's free money, right? You get, $1 million, that's free money. They don't have a clue that there's so much reporting and back end stuff that goes into that. So reporting, I'm going to show you a few examples of some of the reports that we use in order to educate our leadership team about the importance of grants. So this is an example of something that we call our dashboard. A dashboard is something that I do every month at month-end close, and it gets reported to our executive leadership team. So every operational service line is responsible for creating a dashboard like the one that you see in front of you. However, what it looks like varies by operational area. So I had to kind of create a dashboard based off of what I thought leadership would want to know about grants. Again, COVID, worst and best thing to ever happen to us. Prior to COVID, my dashboard got put into a 3-ring binder that goes to our executive leadership team. Grants was probably like in the back pages. Thanks to COVID, we're like page number 5 now. So grants really got elevated during COVID. So it's nice that we were sort of front and center. Some of the things from this report that I want to show you. So we always have a month to date and then a year to date. The things that I report on are actual revenue that got booked onto our general ledger. So this whole top section is not grants that were awarded that, were committed to a certain dollar amount. It is what actually got booked on the general ledger, because that's what affects our bottom line of our organization. So in December, we booked $44.8 million of grant revenue on our general ledger. It always shows where that compares to budget. Our budget was $2.3 million. Obviously, we weren't anticipating COVID. So and then the variance for that month, and then a comparison to like the previous year. So we typically will report our grant revenue by federal, state, private. COVID is on there now, and then our federal contracts. A lot of our market leaders want to know then how this $44.9 million equates onto their books with their specific market or region. So then we have another section where we report by region. So our core regions where we do activities are these listed here: Bemidji, Bismarck, Fargo, Sioux Falls, our network, our long-term care, research, and then kind of other. So then that way, if you are the vice president of finance for our long-term care, you can see that we had $10 million booked in revenue in December for your service line or your long-term care. We also thought it was important to highlight how many FTEs grant support within our organization. So in this instance, grants pay for 324.1 FTEs across our system. And we felt like that was really important to highlight, so we can see the value add that we add to the budget by paying for those FTEs. Then we usually have kind of our information for our department. So we have our team FTEs, our administrative expenses, and our cost to raise $1. So we kind of put that in there just so the people that review the foundation, so the like donor gifts and things like that, can compare the grant team to the foundation a little bit. I know it's not necessarily kind of fair to compare a foundation to a grants team sometimes because they're very different of how they do business. But for our system, we do compare that. And then how many dollars raised per FTE on my team. And then the section down here is where we actually talk about our submissions, awards, and our active grants. And so this is not what we booked on the GL. This is what we have committed to us. So in the month of December, we had $31 million in grants awarded to us, submitted. We had $35 million in grant awards in the month of December. And we had $153 million in active grants at that given time. And then we usually do like a little summary kind of narrative on there as well. So same with year to date, kind of same thing. So this report gets compiled by my team, and then it gets sent to the executive leadership team for their binder that they get after close. This for me really shows and highlights the importance, not only to the bottom line of the budget and the dollars that are booked on your, in your books, but also the potential for what you have. So if I was a leader and I was looking at this, I'd say, great, they booked $44 million on the ledger, but wow, we have $153 million that are out there for committed grants that they could book in, and granted, these are grants that could be 5-year grants, et cetera. But I think it's important for leadership to be able to see that. So this report we send out monthly after we close our books. This next slide is a report that we send out quarterly. It goes to the same executive leadership team. And this is more of a summary report. So this is where we do a narrative. We talk about favorable, not favorable, put in some graphs, but more, it's usually like a 3-page narrative kind of about our grants and an analysis over that last quarter. I think it's important to do a report like this to leadership because then this really tells the story. So our dashboard is numbers, which is great, but if you're not a finance person, you want to really see the story. And so this is where we really will detail out the narrative about some grants and put in some highlights for each market and the grants that they had awarded within that quarter. So I think that it's important to provide a report like this to leadership so they can really see that. We typically will do a comparison of where we were at that point last, the previous year, so they can see if we're operating, better or maybe not from the previous year. Another report that you have on your screen is an example of kind of a project-based report. So as you can imagine, for COVID, we had millions and millions of dollars running through our system. This is a report that I created kind of once we started seeing how much COVID was going to be bringing into our institution back in March of 2020, I guess it would have been. A quick report that I created that shows all of our COVID grants by legal entity that are awarded, and then what we've recognized within on our general ledger. And I updated that every month and sent it to all of the financial leaders, so vice presidents, et cetera, to see how each of their region or market were doing when it came to COVID dollars and spending them. So many COVID dollars, had a cutoff date of when you had to spend those money. So it was important that everyone was on the same page of what we had for total awards and where we were sitting for the balance of those dollars. So similar right now, I have a report that looks very much like this. That's a behavioral health related campaign that we're working on with our foundation to bring in behavioral health dollars. And so I'll create a report similar like this and send it out on a monthly basis to our leaders so they know where we're sitting. If you're not I feel like if you're not in a leader's face front and center every month, they're going to forget about you. So I very much like to be in our leaders' face to make sure they know who we are and what we're doing. Then the other thing is communicating the awards. So how do people know when grants are awarded within your system? So for us, the example down here is a copy of an email that goes out to our various leaders that says, so-and-so was awarded X grant for X dollars for A, B, and C. At Sanford, we have a system that certain people have to approve all grant applications before they are submitted. So this email will go to those same people that have approved that the grant gets submitted. So then they know what happened to that grant. So many times, people will hear that, oh, a grant was submitted, but they never know the outcome of it. So this is our way of just informing people that the grant was actually awarded, that they had approved to be submitted. Another thing that we do is every month, all of our grants get highlighted on our intranet. So our system that we have that when you go open up your internet, it goes to the same page for all employees. We have a communication that goes out that shows all of our grant awards for that month by dollar amount and kind of what the project is. The reason why we do this is not only to kind of make sure grants are out there and people know that if they're interested in a grant, click on this button. So it kind of takes them back to our website to enlist us for working on a grant for them. But also it helps because someone might read this and be like, oh, well, we could do a similar project like that in our area. We should apply for a grant. So it kind of drums up new business as well. So this is another reason why we highlight our grants and internally every month as well. We also highlight our grants externally. So this example on the left is actually one more example of internal, where we pick a certain grant every quarter and we do what's called a showcase, and we kind of do a story. We have our news or marketing people kind of write up a story about a grant, and that gets promoted on our internal website. And sometimes marketing, when they start learning about a grant that we're working on and just maybe the impact it had to our patients, they'll say, oh, do you care if we actually make a story of this and put it out on our news page? But these two examples are examples on social media. So this is our Sanford research. This is our Instagram or LinkedIn. I think it's LinkedIn. Where someone highlighted a research grant that was awarded. And I can tell you that if your organization has like an Instagram, Facebook, what have you kind of page, most of your leaders will follow them. So if you put an announcement that a grant is awarded, even though you're not directly emailing, let's say the president to say, yay, we got a grant, now they just saw it through your social media. So I find that a lot of times when we put something through our social media, our CFO or president will like it. So then I know they've seen it. So this is an example of LinkedIn. And then this is an example of kind of a news release for an NIH grant that we received and kind of that story. The one thing I want to make sure as a reminder, if you are putting something external out on social media or a news story, make sure you review the grant or the funder requirements, because some funders will not allow you to promote or communicate the grant award unless they've approved that, press release or something. I know we're running kind of out of time here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the strategic planning department. If you have one at your organization, I'm not sure how many of you actually have strategic planning departments. We actually do have a strategic planning department at Sanford, and we work very closely with them. So for those of you that do have a separate, maybe strategic planning team, or there's strategy planning happening within your organization, how do you work with them? How can you get a seat at the table to work with them? So in my experience, I really find that having a seat at the table when we're doing strategic planning for our organization really helps for me to understand our annual goals and initiatives for the organization, but then also kind of makes my wheels start turning about how can we find money for those strategies. And so we work very closely with when the strategic priorities are published and our board of trustees approves them. They actually get assigned to different people on my team for prospecting. And then we do a separate financial reporting on each initiative. So kind of how that COVID spreadsheet that I showed you, I actually have one of those for all of our strategic initiatives within the organization. And the champion that's in charge of that strategic initiative actually gets that report from me on a monthly basis so they can see how we are working towards achieving that initiative through grants. And then I meet with those champions on a regular basis to kind of just give a verbal update on how things are going. So like I said, I know we're kind of running short on time, but if you don't have a seat at the table for strategic planning, I highly encourage you to try to get one. If you're not sure how to get that seat, try to see if your supervisor can get you kind of a foot in the door, or who you need to kind of work with to be able to have a seat at that table, because it is so, so, so important. So getting support from the top down. So after seeing some of the kind of productivity measures, the reporting, strategic planning, things like that, what is an easy change to make this month? So as you walk away from this presentation, again, like I said, I'm not the expert, but I've been around and kind of growing my team. So what is a change that you could make this month or even next year? So someone put a question of how would you phrase to show you should be involved in strategic planning? So I don't know if it's a separate department at your organization or if it's like one person that kind of does it for everyone. But what we sort of did to get our foot in the door is to say, we came across the strategic priorities before we were involved within them, within grants. And I said to the person that oversees that department, I can think of 10 grants right here that would fund this strategic priority, but I didn't even know what that priority was and kind of what they want to do and what activities they want to achieve within that priority. And so I just said, I think it would be helpful for me to kind of be a fly on the wall or sit and listen to the strategic priorities as they are developed, to be able to strategize how we can bring more money into the organization for those strategies and elevate them in the future. And as soon as you start talking about bringing more money in, then people usually are like, oh, okay. So that's kind of what the approach that we took. Also, can you think about some templates for your future or some templates that are easy to use, whether you steal maybe some of my examples or, I don't know how many of you currently provide grant reports on a regular basis to your leadership team at your organization, but it's important to come up with some templates because for me, all of those reports that I showed you are templates that I've created, and all I do basically is plop in the numbers every month. Sure, there are some times where I have to totally redesign and create a new template for something I'm working on, but you don't want to spend your entire day working on reports and trying to build your case for yourself or your team. Because if you're an office of one or maybe an office of two, you don't have time for that. So you need to create something that's easy to use that you can just plop some numbers in for consistency. Once you figure out the productivity and kind of that information, that's where I suggest creating a business case template to request additional FTEs. So I have kind of a business case template that I have used in the past, and I basically just kind of, it's sort of like a SBAR, if you're familiar with that tool, where I use an SBAR tool and then I just plop in new information based off of whatever our need is or where I see the FTE help that's needed. So, anytime you can create any kind of tool or template for future use, I'm all about that. And then if your leadership says, nope, we're not adding any more FTEs, the budget, we already are overspent or something, that's where I get creative. So are there grants that maybe would support some of the grant staff to be able to help? We have added grant staff in the past to some of our grants. You have to be very careful for that if you have a negotiated indirect rate, because typically grants are part of that rate. But for some of our entities that don't have a negotiated rate, and maybe it's going to be a very time-intensive grant, we've been able to add in some of my staff's time to be able to help manage the grant on the back end. And funders, quite honestly, sometimes like to see that, because then they know that they're going to have a dedicated person that's going to, make sure that that grant is operating smoothly, compliant, things like that. And then how accessible is your leadership team? Some leadership teams, they are not very accessible. And it's hard to kind of get your foot in the door. How accessible is your leadership team? Someone had asked if there's a good resource for pre-existing templates. I built my own, so I'm not real sure, but I do think sometimes advisory council has some good templates. Sometimes, what is that fundraising? Association for Fundraising Professionals. Sometimes they'll share. I know grant professionals, if you're part of GPA or if you have a membership through there, there's something called a grant space. And sometimes you can put a question out there through like the blog or listserv, and then people will respond and give examples or templates that they use. So I went over a little bit, I apologize, but any questions? Otherwise, I did include my contact information that if you think of a question after the fact, you can certainly email me. I will email the PowerPoint information so then it can be distributed as well. Any questions? See if I can figure out how to not share my screen anymore. maybe.
Thank you, Kristi. We so appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, if you have any questions, certainly just let me know. Otherwise, hopefully it was useful. Like I said, I work for a large organization, so sometimes it's hard to translate that to a smaller organization, but for us, this is what has definitely seemed to work for us.